Oops, I Kissed Him Again, a sweet romantic comedy. Maple Creek Romantic Comedy, Book 1. Written by Cindy Ray Hale. Narrated by Mari B. and John Brattin.
Chapter 1. A cherry-red Corvette zoomed past, leaving a flutter of orange leaves behind. Will Vance, the police chief of Maple Creek, Virginia, pulled out behind the speeding vehicle and flipped on his lights. Layla Bowen. Again. When was she going to learn to lighten her lead foot? The girl drove him nuts. She never seemed to take him seriously, and for some inexplicable reason, he kept going easy on her. Okay, maybe it wasn't completely inexplicable. It might have had something to do with her adorable dimples and her carefree manner. But that didn't mean she hadn't collected a hefty pile of tickets since she'd started driving her granny's Corvette 6 months ago. Anna Bowen was too old to get behind the wheel anymore, and she made the mistake of letting her granddaughter drive her prized Corvette whenever the impulsive girl wanted. Layla should have had her license revoked by now, but he gave her chance after chance. Blast those dimples. They got the best of him every time, making him weak at the knees, putty in her hands. But not this time. This time, he meant business. He caught up to her right in front of the Maple Creek Baptist Church. She pulled over to the side of the road as church members streamed into the sanctuary for the Sunday morning service. Layla stepped out of the Corvette in a floral dress that swayed with her hips in a sassy manner that matched her personality. She wore a straw hat over her shiny brown ringlets and a pair of aviator sunglasses. She looked so good, it should have been illegal. He knew he should tell her to return to her vehicle, but he was so taken by her Sunday morning attire that he clamped his mouth shut. Normally, he was a good cop, an excellent cop. How else would he have become the police chief? But this woman had him whipped, and she knew it. She was his one weakness as an officer. It had started in 7th grade when he'd kissed her in the downstairs closet of her best friend Onyx's family room. They'd been playing 7 Minutes in Heaven, and he'd ended up with her. The kiss was unforgettable. It was his first kiss, and it had left him following her around for the next week. Eventually, she rejected him for some kid on the soccer team. It should have been ancient history, but he'd never really gotten over it. She pulled down the aviators and turned toward the church, stopping mid-stride, her glossy lips parting. Layla's mother and Mrs. Wheaton, the town gossip, were walking toward the entrance of the church. They stopped and turned to look at Will, and Mrs. Bowen's smile turned downward into a scowl. Layla stared at the two of them, and her face went pale. She looked at Will, and then she looked back at the women, panic written all over her features. She stepped toward him impulsively, and before he could even process what was happening, she threw her arms around his neck and pressed her lips to his. They were perfect and warm, and tasted like honey. For a moment, all he knew was their kiss. Fireworks exploded in his head, and he wrapped his arms around her tiny waist, drawing her into him. How long had he wondered what another kiss with Layla would be like? The first one had curled his toes, and this one was no different. Every expectation had been met, and then some.
"Layla Bowen, what in heaven's name do you think you're doing?"
The unmistakable voice of Mary Bowen lanced through the fantasy world wherein he'd lost himself. Layla pulled away, hastily whispering,
"Just play along."
Her eyes were large and vulnerable, and he had to stop himself from grabbing her and pulling her in for another kiss. Will's head was still spinning from the kiss. He didn't think he had another option at that point. He could hardly do more than just stand there like the fool he'd just allowed himself to become.
"Oh, hi there, Mama. I didn't see you there. Save me a seat in the chapel, will you?" "Don't you play coy with me, Layla. You can't just go kissing the police to get out of a speeding ticket. I raised you better than that." "You misunderstand, Mama. Will wasn't pulling me over for speeding."
She turned to Will and batted her long, seductive eyelashes at him. He had no idea where she was going with this, but he knew he was in deep trouble.
"Will and I are getting married."
"What?" Will sputtered. Had he had one too many drinks at Dixie's Tavern and said something he'd forgotten? She placed a hand on his chest.
It's okay, baby. I know I told you I wasn't going to tell my family yet, but I really am ready now.
He stared at her, mouth agape. All words and logic had flown from his mind. Instead, Layla's floral perfume filled his senses, making his head spin with her nearness.
I'll catch up with you in a few minutes. Save me a seat, Mama.
She waved her mother away. Her mother returned to Mrs. Wheaton, who had been standing on the sidewalk, watching the entire exchange. The two women were inseparable and had always reminded Will of a couple of mother hens. Will cleared his throat, dropping back into his role as police chief. If he didn't gain control of the situation, he would become the town laughingstock. I ought to arrest you for your conduct here today, Miss Bowen. You know that kiss could be considered an assault of a police officer. Layla stepped back and bit down on her cherry-red bottom lip, the same red as her Corvette.
But you won't arrest me, will you?
No, I won't. But don't you ever try something like that again. If you do, you'll find yourself in the back of my police cruiser. Understood?
I understand.
For a moment, genuine fear flashed in Layla's eyes. Why, oh why, did he allow that to make him feel guilty? He swallowed down his guilt and said, License and registration, please. Layla returned to her car sulkily and produced the documents. A few moments later, he returned to her with the speeding ticket she'd earned fair and square. He handed it to her with a wink and a smile. Watch the speedometer and obey the speed limit. I know that's hard for you, but just try. Or next time I won't be smiling. And neither will you. She pushed out her bottom lip in a pout, and he hoped she was finally starting to take him seriously. But somehow he doubted it.
Chapter 2. Layla tried to avoid her mother when the church service ended, but it was no use. The woman caught up to her just outside the building. The worst part would be the endless questions. Why did her mother have to know the answer to everything? For the past 2 years, Layla's mother had pressured her to find a husband, nonstop. At least, that was how it felt. Layla was at the end of her rope. If she had to hear one more time about how her eggs were drying up, and that was why she'd grabbed Will and kissed him like that, it was a move of pure desperation. She really didn't have another choice. But that kiss? Wow. It was the most incredible kiss she'd experienced in years. She had to shut down the train of thought immediately. She couldn't allow herself to think about Will that way. It was too dangerous. Layla, her mom said, catching up to her out of breath. I hope you know I'm not buying that charade you tried to push on me before church. Layla paused and turned to her mom with a big smile. You mean Will? That wasn't a charade. I've never even seen you with him before, and now you expect me to believe that you're getting married? Will and I go way back, Mom. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Technically, it was true. Will was her first kiss. How could she ever forget that? But she'd never told her mom. It was none of her business. Her mom narrowed her eyes at Layla, like she was declaring war. Wonderful. Then why don't you invite him over for lunch? If he's going to be a part of the family, we want him around for all our activities. Layla scrambled for something to say while she held her smile frozen in place. Will is... She thought of the ticket tucked into her handbag, and her smile widened. He's working today, or I'm sure he'd be delighted to join us. Maybe another time? Yes, you let me know when he's off work, and we'll plan a family dinner in his honor. Her mom turned like she was about to head to her car, but then she paused and rotated back to face Layla. Her eyes narrowed again. If you're engaged, then why don't you have a ring? I have a ring. It's being sized right now. You'd better not be lying to me. This entire thing feels fishy. I'm not lying, I promise, Layla fibbed. You'll see the truth soon enough. But Layla had no idea how she was going to get herself out of the corner she just lied herself into. Layla scooted up to the bar at Dixie's Tavern later that night. After the day she'd had, she could use an ice-cold drink. She didn't actually drink alcohol. She was way too much of a health nut for that. But she loved club soda with lime. The door pushed open, and Onyx stepped through, heading toward Layla and taking a seat next to her at the bar. Onyx had a blue streak through her wavy blonde hair. Hey, Layla said. I like the blue. Thanks. I had Lauren at it for me when I went in to get my highlights touched up. Both Layla and Onyx went to Lauren's salon to get their hair done. Lauren had gone to high school with them, and Layla loved catching up with her when she got her hair done. What's this I hear about you being engaged? Onyx asked. Before Layla could piece together a coherent response, Onyx grabbed Layla's bare hand. Where's the ring? Onyx turned her hand over like that would somehow make the ring appear. Layla thought fast. She didn't want Onyx to know she'd fibbed about being engaged to Will. So she answered the question with another question to redirect the conversation. How'd you hear about that? I overheard your mom and Mrs. Wheaton talking about it at Josie's coffee shop this afternoon. It's supposed to be a secret. Onyx scrunched her brow in confusion. A secret? What for? Keep your voice down, Layla said, lowering her own voice. An idea formed in her mind, and she went with it. It's what Will wants. He's still fresh out of his divorce, and he doesn't want people gossiping about him for getting remarried so fast. So don't tell anyone about this until I talk to him, and he says he's ready for people to know. Okay, I won't say anything, Onyx said, twisting up the napkin in front of her. I can't believe you were dating Will behind my back. How long has this been going on? A while. Layla hoped Onyx didn't press her with more questions. She flagged down Dixie to place their order, with the hope that it would distract Onyx from interrogating her about her relationship with Will. She didn't like lying to her friend, but she didn't want Onyx spreading rumors that she was engaged either. She hadn't even gotten Will to agree. The two girls ordered their drinks and sipped them for a few moments. The door pushed open again, and this time, Will Vance stepped through. Look who's here, Onyx said, wiggling her eyebrows at Layla. Layla's heart jumped into her throat. Will looked drool-worthy in a classic white t-shirt and jeans with a pair of lace-up work boots. Don't think about that kiss. She'd had a complicated relationship with Will up until this point. He was her first kiss in 7th grade, and it had been intense. Too intense. After that, she'd immediately began avoiding him, and she could tell it had made him bitter. She had a suspicion that he'd been targeting her for speeding because he was still sore over her rejection all those years ago. She knew she was to blame for most of the tickets, but sometimes she wondered if he was just picking on her to get his revenge. Will stopped to talk to Taylor Roberts, a local orthopedic surgeon. Onyx scowled. We don't like him. Who, Taylor? Layla asked, scrunching her brow in confusion. They'd gone to school with him, and he'd always seemed nice enough when they were kids. He'd always been the smart, nerdy kid in school. But now, he was a very hot, very single doctor. He and Will had been best friends for as long as Layla could remember. Yes, Dr. Roberts, Onyx said in a snooty voice. He thinks he's all high and mighty because he has a medical degree. Layla was used to Onyx railing against traditional medicine. Onyx's parents owned a local crystal shop and raised Onyx to practice natural healing techniques. What did he do wrong? Layla asked, sipping her club soda, trying to keep a smile off her face. She suspected that Onyx was crushing on the guy, and had been for a while. But Onyx would be the last one to admit that she had the hots for a doctor, someone entrenched in Western medicine. He took the last available booth for the Maple Creek Fall Festival. My mom has had her crystal shop at that festival every year for the last 20 years. He saw my mom in line ahead of him yesterday. She had to run to the car to get her driver's license. And when she came back, he signed up for the last booth for his medical practice. Maybe he didn't know it was the last booth, Layla said. I don't know. I wasn't there. I just know my mom was pretty disappointed about missing out, Onyx said. Onyx went on and on about how offensive Taylor was, but Layla's mind began to drift. Her eyes trailed after Will and fixated on his bulging biceps as he talked to Taylor. He looked like he was about to start a game of pool with Taylor, and she wanted to talk to him before he got wrapped up in the game. I'll be right back, she said over her shoulder to Onyx as she slid off her bar stool. She sauntered across the room to Will with a flirty smile. Can I talk to you privately? She asked Will as he and Taylor approached the pool table. Will looked even better up close, and he smelled amazing, like cedar and warm spices. Of course. He slid into a nearby booth. Is this private enough? Sure. She took a seat across from him. She tucked her hair behind her ears. So, about the engagement. I feel like I need to explain myself to you. I can see why you would feel that way. Will flashed a smile at her that made butterflies dance in her belly. She was dangerously attracted to him, and always had been. That was why she usually tried to keep her distance. But now, because of the trouble her impulsivity had gotten her into, she was about to do the opposite. If all went as planned, anyway. You have to understand something. My mom is relentless. She's always obsessing about me getting married and having kids. My clock is always ticking, but I don't care if it is. I'm not looking to get married anytime soon. Hopefully never. I don't do relationships, but my mom doesn't want to hear about that. After what she'd been through, she'd sworn off relationships forever. I see. I just thought you didn't want your mom to know you were getting another speeding ticket. That too. She's always telling me to stop driving Nana's Corvette because I can't help but speed when I'm driving it. It's not the worst idea. Your mom just wants what's best for you. He waved a server over and ordered a beer. Layla scowled at him. The last thing she needed was another lecture on her driving habits. Do you have another car you could drive? Layla sighed. Yes, I have an older Honda Civic, but it's so blah compared to the Corvette, you know? Will's eyes danced back at her with a faint smile playing at the edges of his lips. Yeah, I know. Layla sipped her club soda. My mom doesn't believe me that we're engaged. She wants you to come to a family dinner to prove that we're really together. But we're not. Will pointed out with an amused look on his face. I know, but I'm sick of my mom judging me for being reckless and getting myself in trouble. If she finds out you were actually pulling me over for another speeding ticket, she'll never let me hear the end of it. A wide grin stretched across Will's attractive face. But I was pulling you over for another speeding ticket. Can you be my date to a family dinner and pretend to be engaged to me for a while? At least until we can convince her that Chris Strapp isn't right for me. Chris Strapp? Yeah, she's always trying to set me up with him. She thinks he's perfect for me. I think he's perfectly boring. You know what I think? Will said, smiling broadly again. What? Layla's heart pounded in her chest, and she leaned forward in anticipation of what he had to say next. He grabbed his beer from the server, who had just returned, and took a long swallow. He set the glass down on the table and looked Layla directly in the eye. "I think you're out of your mind."
"Oh, come on. If you agree, I'll pay my speeding tickets,"
she said with a grin.
It might be a good idea to do that anyway. You're not exactly in a place to negotiate right now.
Layla's heart sunk. She should have known that Will wouldn't help her. He was always making her life harder, not easier. She chewed on the edge of her bright red acrylic nail.
"You and I have something in common," Will said.
"What's that?"
"I don't do relationships either. I can't risk even a fake relationship with you. I just went through a nasty divorce."
Layla had heard about that. Mrs. Wheaton had given her mom all the details, and Layla had heard about them whether she liked it or not. Apparently, his ex-wife had cheated on him with the town surgeon, one of Taylor's co-workers. The cheating couple ended up moving to Texas or someplace when the surgeon took a job out of state. But Layla hadn't thought of that when she'd grabbed Will and kissed him. Shame burned her cheeks, and she pushed up from the table.
"I'm sorry to have bothered you about all this. I won't trouble you with it again."
She walked across the tavern to where Onyx still sat at the bar. "You look really good with Will," Onyx told her.
"Think so?"
Layla asked. "When are you coming to my shop to try on a wedding dress?" Onyx asked. "Ooh, you need to see this gorgeous vintage lace dress that I just got in. It would look fantastic with your skin tone."
"We're not quite to that point yet,"
Layla said.
But you'll be the first to know when we are."
Was she going to have to tell Onyx the truth? She really didn't want to. Humiliation from Will's rejection burned on her cheeks. She looked over her shoulder at Will. He'd moved back to the pool table and had started a game with Taylor and a few other guys. Just then, Will's words sunk into her mind. He'd said he didn't do relationships. Did that mean he'd been thinking this might turn real? Or that it was already getting too real for him? Their kiss had been pretty incredible, and it had definitely caught her off guard. But with her mom on her case so heavily, she hadn't allowed herself to stop and think about their kiss, and what it might have meant to Will. She shook her head to clear her thoughts. She refused to allow her mind to go down the road of wondering how Will felt about their kiss, because wherever it led, she couldn't go. She just couldn't.
Chapter 3. Will said goodbye to Ryan Seal, the owner of Accounting Solutions, and stepped out onto Main Street. Ryan had just reported a robbery, and Will was investigating it. Directly across the street, with an excellent view of the accounting firm, stood Fresh-Cut Flowers, the floral shop Layla owned. Will had promised himself at the tavern last night that he was going to steer clear of Layla, but duty called. He walked through the crosswalk to the other side of the street and opened the door to Layla's shop. A cheerful bell rang as he entered, and the scent of flowers hit his nose immediately. Layla stood behind the counter, looking up at him in surprise.
"Change your mind?"
she asked with a hopeful expression. Her brown waves were partially pulled back with a few tendrils framing her face. Why did she have to look so beautiful? He'd spent the night tossing and turning, thinking about the kiss they'd shared. He shook his head. "No, I haven't changed my mind. I'm here because of a robbery across the street at Accounting Solutions. Were you here last night? Ryan's office was broken into sometime after 9, and we're looking for witnesses."
"Oh, no,"
Layla said.
"Poor Ryan. I'll have to take him some flowers to cheer him up. He always does such a great job on my taxes, and my books would be a disaster without him. But to answer your question, I wasn't here last night. I was at the tavern with you, remember?"
"Of course, but you didn't stop by here or even drive past?" Will asked.
"No, I went straight home. I didn't even pass by here. I keep telling Ryan he needs to install a security camera at his office.
If there's anything you can think of that may help Ryan's case, please give me a call.
Will pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on the countertop before Layla. She picked it up with a coy smile. You sure you don't just want to give me your number?
Will cleared his throat. That's my business number. He looked back into Layla's brown eyes. They were so full of life, always dancing with laughter and fun. You know, if you'd wanted to convince your mom that we were actually together, you should have told her we had just gone on a first date. That would have been more believable than an engagement. You could have added in the engagement later.
Are you saying you're considering it? Layla asked, a teasing glint in her eyes.
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Then why did he bring it up? Was there a part of him that wanted to play along with Layla's fake engagement? Maybe it could be fun. He'd been so focused on work, a little bit of fun couldn't hurt, could it? But who was he kidding? He was the chief of police. He couldn't go around pretending to be engaged to someone. Could he? On Tuesday night, Will went to Dixie's to shoot some pool with Taylor before heading home. He aimed carefully and then knocked a ball into the corner pocket. He'd been working all day to find a list of suspects for Ryan's robbery. He'd been scouring lists of Ryan's clients and employees, checking to see if any of them had criminal records. Ryan said he didn't normally store large amounts of cash at the office, but a client had just dropped off $40,000 in cash. Ryan's employee, Joe, had handled the transaction on a day Ryan was out of the office. Joe had meant to deposit it in the bank for the client immediately, but had gotten caught up with several other clients, and the bank had closed for the weekend. When Ryan got back to the office Monday morning, the glass door was shattered, and the money was gone. One of the clients, Judson Carter, had a criminal record. The guy was a real creep, and his alibi hadn't checked out. He'd been convicted of a couple of robberies and was a known wife-beater. It just so happened that he was at the bar and had been drinking heavily that night. Judd was his number one suspect. He made another shot, knocking 3 more balls into various pockets simultaneously. He really was on top of his pool game tonight. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Judd leaning toward the gorgeous brunette next to him. Her back was to him, so he couldn't see her face. She angled her body toward Judd, and Will's stomach clenched as he recognized her. It was Layla. As she took in whatever Judd was saying, her expression changed from her usual bubbly persona to disgust.
You okay?
Taylor asked, glancing at Will.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Will's hand tightened around his pool stick, and he had to put it down so he didn't charge across the room to beat Judd upside the head with it. He glanced across the room again, to where Layla sat with Onyx, just in time to see Judd reach out and touch a lock of Layla's hair.
I'll be right back, Taylor, Will said, zeroing in on Layla. I need to take care of something. Police business, he added.
He didn't want Taylor to get on his case again after the teasing he'd given him after Layla had pulled him aside at Dixie's the other night. Oh, sure, Taylor mocked. Police business, huh? Will didn't answer him. Instead, he crossed the room to Layla and Onyx.
Step away from Layla, Judson.
Chief Vance. Judson gave him a toothy smile. Several of his teeth were discolored, crooked, or missing altogether. And even from far away, he could smell the rotting garbage odor wafting from his mouth. Well, Layla put her hand on his arm, and his body tensed. Her touch sent a jolt through him, and he immediately thought about how amazing their kiss had been. Both kisses. He turned toward her. I can take care of myself, Will. You don't need to protect me, Layla said.
Is Judson bothering you?
She pulled her hand away. I was handling it just fine.
So, in other words, yes,
Will said, turning to Judd with a threatening look. He clenched his fist at his side, ready to put the creep in his place, but Layla's hand was back on his arm, and he uncurled his fist. Just go back and enjoy your game of pool with Taylor. I'll be fine over here, okay?
Layla assured him. Will took a step back. Okay. It took everything in him to return to the pool table. As he walked away, he heard Onyx say,
"That was the sweetest thing ever. You really do have an amazing guy."
Did Layla tell Onyx that they were engaged? He shook his head and chuckled to himself. Layla was something else. He wondered how long Layla was going to be able to keep up the lie if he didn't play the part. For the next hour, he kept glancing over to where Layla was sitting. Guy after guy came to hit on her, and for some reason, Will couldn't concentrate on his game anymore, and he ended up losing 3 times in a row. "Someone's distracted tonight," Taylor teased. "No more distracted than you. I've seen you check Onyx out more than once tonight," Will shot back. "I think she hates me," Taylor said. "She keeps giving me death glares." "Why?" Will asked. "I have no idea. She's a weird girl." "A weird girl you can't keep your eyes off of," Will pointed out. A few minutes later, Will went to the bar to get a refill and saw Chris Trapp hovering around Layla with his dorky striped polo shirt and buck teeth. Wasn't that the guy Layla said her mom wanted to set her up with? He was all over her, and she was laughing at something he'd just said. Then, like her laughter had given him the courage, he reached out to stroke Layla's hair. She shrunk away from his touch, and her face turned a bit green. That was it. Will couldn't take another second, and that was when he made a snap decision to act on an impulse. He walked up to Layla and put his arm around her shoulder. She turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise, and he pressed his lips to her head. Her hair smelled fresh, like vanilla shampoo. He could get lost in that smell forever. "Just play along," he murmured against her ear, repeating the words she'd said to him Sunday morning. Then he raised his voice for all to hear. "You ready to get out of here, baby?"
"Baby?"
Chris scoffed.
"What, are you guys, like, together or something?"
Will could hear the anger lacing his tone. Clearly, Chris had wanted Layla all to himself. "Yeah," Will said, entwining her fingers with his. "We're, like, together." Chris looked back and forth between them like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. As much as he didn't like the guy, he couldn't really blame him for questioning their relationship status. He'd basically ignored Layla all night. He would never have treated a real girlfriend so terribly. But it couldn't be helped. All he knew was he couldn't stomach one more guy putting his hands on Layla, and especially not this guy. And he could tell Chris was making her uncomfortable. Layla turned to him with a triumphant smile.
"I'm ready to go if you are."
Will pulled some cash from his wallet and paid for their tabs. Layla looked like she wanted to protest, but then noticed Chris scrutinizing her and clamped her mouth shut. She hopped down from her bar stool and followed Will as he led her out to the parking lot. "Did you drive tonight?"
"No, I walked. I just live around the corner,"
Layla said. "Would you like me to walk you home?" Will asked.
"Sure."
They walked together in silence for a moment before Layla spoke up again.
"I know I told you I can take care of myself, but I want to thank you for coming over when you did. Chris creeps me out. I can't really put my finger on it, but there's something about him that just feels off. I don't know. I'm probably overthinking it. He's probably harmless, just a little pushy. It's like he doesn't understand social cues."
"Oh, I think he understands them just fine. He just doesn't respect boundaries."
"You think so?"
Layla asked. How could she be so naive? The guy had predator written all over him. Will had spent his entire life studying criminals, and the more he saw of Chris, the more he began to see red flags. "I've decided to take you up on your offer of a fake engagement."
"Why now?"
"I don't like the way Chris looks at you."
"I told you, I can take care of myself."
"I know. Anyway, if it makes you feel any better, I thought about it, and it sounds like it could be fun."
"You? Fun? I didn't know you had that word in your vocabulary."
"Are you saying I take life too seriously?" Will asked.
"Obviously," You're the definition of serious.
That's not true. I know how to have fun, just like anyone else, Will said defensively. Layla rolled her eyes.
Sure, whatever you say. My grandma is 87, and she knows how to have more fun than you do.
I know this about your grandma. I've been called more than once on a noise complaint connected with her in one way or another. Layla giggled, and Will found it so endearing he wanted to pull her into his arms and tickle her relentlessly. So let's talk about how this fake romance is going to work, Will said.
Yes, we need some ground rules,
Layla agreed. What did you have in mind?
We need a ring, because I sort of told my mom it was getting sized.
Will scowled. A ring? You've got to be kidding me.
We can just get one of those cubic zirconium ones.
Okay, fine. I'll get you a ring.
Great. Next, we need to pick a time for us to break up. Don't think this thing is turning into anything real. I don't do relationships. Nothing has changed,
Layla said. That won't be a problem. Remember, I'm fresh out of a divorce. I'm not looking for a relationship either. So let's plan to break up before Christmas.
That works for me.
Layla crossed her arms as they walked in the dim light the occasional street lamp gave off.
Oh, one more rule.
What's that? Will asked. Layla turned and looked at Will with a flirty smile.
No kissing.
The girl was a tease. How are we supposed to convince anyone that we're a real couple if we can't kiss? Will asked.
We'll just tell them we don't like PDA,
Layla said, like it was the answer to everything. Okay, fine. He didn't like it, but he understood why she would come up with a rule like that. Because when they kissed, it curled his toes and left his head spinning. And he wasn't sure his heart could handle another kiss like that.
Chapter 4. When Layla got to work the next morning, the back door was hanging ajar, and the place was a disaster. Heart pounding, she raced to the room where she kept the money locked up, but nothing was amiss, and the office door was still locked up. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed the business number Will had left for her.
Layla, is everything okay?
Someone broke into my shop.
I'll be right there.
The door to her shop swung open, and Onyx strolled in with 2 cups from Josie's. She took one look at Layla's terrified face and said, "Girl, you're as white as a sheet. What happened?"
Someone broke into my shop last night.
What? That's awful, Onyx said. I brought you the herbal detox tea from Josie's. Maybe that can help soothe your nerves.
You're so sweet,
Layla said, as she gratefully took the cup from Onyx. She sipped the hot liquid.
You know me so well.
Onyx was the one who had gotten her into healthy eating. Layla loved all her recommendations. It looks like your man just got here, Onyx said.
Will?
Layla said, glancing out to see Will's police cruiser pulled up in front of her store. He stepped from the vehicle, and Layla's heart beat even faster. But this time, it wasn't from fear. Will looked good enough to save her in his police uniform. He pushed open the door and stepped inside the shop.
Good morning, ladies,
he greeted them.
Sorry I'm not visiting you under better circumstances.
After a quick search of the premises, they confirmed that nothing was missing, except for the VCR tape she used for her outdated surveillance system.
Will, I think whoever robbed Ryan was worried about the footage I may have of them from my cameras.
I'm sorry you got caught up in this mess.
Will reached out for her, and she fell into his embrace. Normally, she wouldn't have agreed to so much physical contact, but she was scared, and she welcomed the safety and comfort of his arms. Layla pulled out her oil paint and set up her easel the following Saturday afternoon at Maple Creek Park. There was a lovely duck pond, and the afternoon sunlight was hitting the water just right. Layla loved that duck pond. As a little girl, she used to squeal with delight when she fed the ducks little pieces of torn bread. Now, as an adult, she loved to visit to escape from everything. She'd painted the pond many times, but each painting seemed to tell a different story. Sometimes, it reflected pain or loneliness. But today, the canvas begged to tell a new story. "You're pretty talented," a familiar voice said from behind her. She twisted around to see Chris standing there.
"What are you doing here?"
she asked. She couldn't help the irritation that came into her voice. Something about the way he talked felt like nails on a chalkboard to her. "Not much. Just out enjoying the beauty of nature." He gave her a pointed look, and Layla got the impression that he included her as part of nature. Her skin crawled. Everything about him repulsed her. Her mom liked Chris because he was wealthy. He owned several houses in the area and rented them out all over Maple Creek. Normally, Layla would have respected that, but his creepy nature canceled any level of admiration she might have felt for him. She wasn't attracted to him at all, and even worse, he constantly got on her nerves. "Painting looks relaxing, but I know it can be hard work too," Chris said. "I've tried it a few times myself."
"Oh, that's nice,"
Layla said, as she added a stroke to the water. She tried to think of a way to get him to leave, but she wasn't coming up with anything. "My shoulders always get so knotted up when I paint."
"Mine do too,"
Layla said. In fact, her shoulders were killing her right then. She rolled them a few times to loosen them up. Chris seemed to notice. "I can work out those knots for you." He put his hands on her shoulders, and she immediately wiggled from his grasp.
"I don't think so,"
Layla said, her discomfort growing. Something hissed beside her, and Layla screamed. She turned in time to see a large goose lower its head before it began attacking her bare legs, biting in rapid succession. She got up and ran, but her skirt was tight and her legs could barely move. She stumbled and face-planted into the mud. Chris's laughter sounded above her. Layla turned to look up, making a loud sucking sound following her movements as her cheek released from the mud. Chris hovered over her. "Well, that was graceful."
"Don't you have something better to do?"
Layla pushed up onto her hands and knees. She stood up and looked down at her floral dress. Her entire front was covered in oozing mud from head to toe.
"Oh, my favorite dress."
She wiped at the mud, but it was no use. Her shoulders drooped with her frustration. She looked around for something to clean herself with. Her eyes landed on the duck pond. She walked over to the water's edge and took off her ankle boots and socks. "What are you doing?" Chris asked from behind her. Why was he still here? Couldn't she just wash off the mud in peace? She gasped as she took the first step into the surprisingly cold water. She began wading deeper into the water, but her feet sunk into the sludge and squished between her toes. Her feet were stuck as the mud sucked them into place. She tried to take a step forward, but instead, her entire body tumbled forward. "Ah!" she screamed as she put her hands out to break her fall. Water splashed into her face and shot up her nose. "Are you okay?" Chris asked. She turned her face to the side, sputtering.
"I'm fine,"
she insisted. The last thing she needed right now was Chris trying to help her. His touch was worse than the sludge at the bottom of the pond. Mud squished between her fingers. She removed her hand from the sticky goo and waved it around in the water to get it off. Then, she began wiping off her face and torso as her knees sunk deeper into the tar-like mud. Just then, she heard the hissing again, and she pivoted her head to see her attacker returning. This time, he looked more aggressive than ever. She screamed and scrambled deeper into the pond. But now, she was in the enemy's territory. The mud sucked at her as she fought it to get away from the angry animal. But the goose attacked her, biting at her arms and legs. She screamed and flailed, but the goose was relentless. "Hey, get away from her!" Layla turned to the sound of rescue to see Will charging at the goose, running full speed toward them. The goose took flight and honked its way to the other side of the pond as Will chased after it.
"Will!"
Layla wasn't sure whether to be relieved or mortified that he'd shown up. Taking advantage of Will being busy chasing off the goose, Chris ran into the water, fully clothed, to help her stand up. "Here," Chris said. "Take my arm." She was about to turn him down, but she lost her balance and fell into him. He caught her body and held her against him, stroking her back like he was comforting her. Only it made her feel worse. "Come on, let's get you out of here," he said, as he escorted her from the pond. "I have a towel in my car you can use," Chris said. "Let's head over there and get you cleaned up. I even have a roll of paper towels in my trunk."
I don't want to ruin your towel,
Layla protested, scrambling to think of some excuse to get away from him.
I'm a huge mess right now.
"It's just a towel," he said, pulling her toward his car. "Don't worry about it. I can't believe this stupid park doesn't have any public restrooms. After we get you toweled off, I'll take you to my place where you can really get cleaned up. I live just a block away." Unexplained panic snaked through Layla's chest.
No,
Layla said.
"Are you kidding me? I'm not going anywhere with you."
"I'm trying to help you, Layla. Don't you see that?"
No, I don't see that. I'm engaged to Will. It would be inappropriate for me to go home with you.
You don't have to be so rude. I would never suggest that we do anything inappropriate. Yeah, right. Somehow, she didn't believe that for a second.
You know what? I want you to leave me alone. Stop talking to me.
Whoa, settle down. He caressed her arm, like that was supposed to make her calm. It did just the opposite.
I'm not trying to be inappropriate.
I just want to be friends, Layla. Is there anything wrong with that?
I don't want to be friends.
She jerked her arm away from him.
So stop talking to me, don't call me, don't text me, and don't approach me again. Do you understand?
Chris scowled at her, but before he could say anything, Will came up behind her and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "I found this in my car and thought you could use it."
"Thank you, Will."
She turned to him with gratitude in her eyes.
"Chris was just leaving."
She turned and gave him a nasty glare. "I just need to understand why you don't want to be friends," Chris said. "She just told you she doesn't want you to talk to her," Will said. "You'd better listen to her."
"I just need a simple explanation. That's all I'm asking for,"
Chris said. "Well, you're not going to get one. You'd better decide you can live with that." "This is so ridiculous," Chris said. "You're both making something small into something huge, but I can tell when I'm not wanted, so I'll go." And he finally did. He made a big show of being a victim by frowning and hanging his head down, and then he retreated to his car. If that was supposed to make Layla feel guilty, it wasn't working. "Are you okay?" Will asked her, brushing her hair behind her neck. She shivered beneath his touch, and although she knew he was only acting in case Chris happened to look back at them, it sent a thrill through her.
"No, Chris is really starting to freak me out."
"I'm not surprised. I pegged him as a creeper from the first moment I met him. But I'm sorry you had to deal with him like that." Layla swallowed down her fear and pulled the blanket around her shoulders tighter. Will bent down to get a closer look at her painting. "Did you paint this?" he asked.
"Yes. I was painting it until the goose attacked me, and I landed in the mud."
"You're very talented." That was what Chris had said, but for some reason, she believed it more coming from Will. Somehow, it felt more genuine. "You're painting, I mean, but it does take a certain level of talent to get that muddy."
"You should be jealous of my ability to get muddy,"
Layla said, looking up into his handsome face. "I'm totally not," Will said, with a goofy grin.
"Are you available tomorrow night? My parents have invited us over for dinner."
"I am. I'd be delighted to come."
"My mom's been relentless about me dating him. She still doesn't believe that you and I are engaged. I almost have to wonder if she sent him over here. How'd he know I was going to be here today?
Layla looked over at Will.
For that matter, how'd you know?
I was driving by and saw you painting. I decided to come say hi.
Layla packed up the last of her painting supplies and stood up.
We're going to need to up our game to get my mom to believe we really are engaged.
Well, hopefully this will help.
Will pulled out a small black box. He opened it to reveal a sparkling ring inside. A large, round-cut diamond sat in the center, surrounded by swirls of smaller diamonds on either side.
That is definitely not cubic zirconium,
Layla said.
No, it's not.
Layla looked up at him with a question in her heart.
It belonged to my grandmother. I'm not sure it will fit you, but I figured it would be more believable than something from the jewelry section of Walmart.
Layla rinsed her hand off in the pond and then took the ring from him and slipped it onto her finger. It was a little loose, but not enough that it would slip off and get lost.
I'd say that's a reasonably good fit,
she declared.
Good. Please take care of it. And I hope you don't mind, but I want it back after we stage our breakup.
Layla handed the ring back to him.
Will, I can't possibly take this ring from you.
No, it's okay. I already told you I wasn't going through with another marriage, so it doesn't really matter. But it was my grandma's, and I want it kept safe.
Layla smiled at him.
I can do that for you. Thank you for trusting me with such a special ring.
Layla finally got Will's personal phone number put into her phone. She texted him her mom's address, and they met at her doorstep on Sunday afternoon. Her parents lived in a beautifully remodeled house that was built in 1914. The front porch had a swing that she'd spent her childhood swinging on. It had been a happy home for her. Will took her hand, and she curled her fingers around his. Her heart warmed at his touch. It felt nice, like they belonged together, despite what she knew to be the truth. The front door swung open, and her mom pulled them in before Layla could even reach for the doorknob.
Hi, Mom,
Layla said cheerfully. She fought to keep the nervousness out of her voice, but she wasn't doing the best job.
It's good to see you again, Chief Vance,
Layla's father said.
Oh, please, call me Will.
Her parents led them to the dining room, where the table was laden with her mother's typical Sunday night dinner. Pot roast, potatoes, carrots, and salad. She also spied her mother's famous chocolate cake sitting on the counter in the kitchen. Not that she'd be eating it, but it did look beautiful. Her mom scrutinized her, like she was already imagining how Layla's genetics would blend with Will's to make the perfect grandchildren. Panic grabbed at her heart. She just had to get through this one dinner. She pictured Chris Trapp's hands on her shoulders and shuddered. She loved her mom, but she didn't appreciate her pushy nature. She had to get her mom to see that she was capable of choosing her own man. And Will was perfect for that. Will settled on the chair next to hers.
Would you like some iced tea?
She asked him.
Sure.
She tried to still her shaking hands as she poured his glass, but she ended up missing his glass entirely, and somehow the tea landed on his lap instead of in his glass.
Oh, Will, I'm so sorry.
She grabbed a wad of napkins from her mom's decorative napkin holder on the table and began frantically dabbing at his lap until she realized what she was doing and how red Will's face was turning.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll just let you clean that yourself.
She turned to see both her parents staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. And now, she could feel her own face turning red.
Sorry about that. Dad, do you have another pair of pants Will can change into?
Sure I do, her dad said. Her dad and Will left the room, leaving her alone with her mother.
Is that your ring?
Her mom asked.
Oh, yeah.
Layla thrust her hand toward her mom.
This is gorgeous.
She studied it like she couldn't quite believe it was real,
because that would have to mean that Layla was telling the truth.
Supposedly.
But Will was awesome enough to hook her up with a decent ring. He really was such a great fake fiancé. Even if he did seem hesitant to help her at first, he was much more pleasant to spend time with when he wasn't scolding her or handing her yet another speeding ticket.
How did he propose? Her mom asked. Shoot.
Layla hadn't thought of that. So she said the first thing that popped into her head. She saw her mom's crystal bowl of jelly beans sitting on the living room table in the next room.
He took me to the candy shop on 5th Street. He bought me a bag of pink lemonade jelly beans, and the ring was inside.
Layla sat back in her chair, satisfied with her impromptu proposal story.
The candy shop? Her mom asked. You don't even eat sugar. You're always on some detox or cleanse.
I eat sugar from time to time.
She really didn't, but her mom didn't have to know that.
I haven't seen you touch my chocolate cake once in the past 5 years. Well, I'll have a slice tonight then.
What's this?
Will said, as he came back into the room looking between Layla and her mother. He had on a pair of her father's pants, and they looked ridiculous on him. They were much too big, and her dad had given him a belt to keep the pants from falling to the floor.
I was just telling my mom that I'm looking forward to eating a slice of her cake tonight. I don't always avoid sugar, right, baby?
She gave him a huge, encouraging smile and hoped he'd catch on.
That's true.
Sometimes she even drinks soda.
She didn't. Ever.
And her mom knew it.
Well, isn't this such a surprise?
Her mother said. She'd been trying to get Layla to loosen up on her strict dietary standards for years.
I happen to have an ice-cold cherry Coke in the refrigerator with your name on it, Layla. Oh, great,
Layla said, doing her best to keep from cringing. She'd worked tirelessly for years to eat clean, and tonight was going to ruin her streak of 5 years with no refined sugars. Why, oh why did she have to say he'd proposed in a candy store, of all places? Her mom set a glass of ice in front of her and made a big show of opening the can of cherry Coke right in front of her and pouring it over the ice.
There you go, honey. Drink up.
Layla forced a smile.
Thanks, Mom.
The fizz from the drink hit her in the face as she took a sip. After 5 years without drinking a single can of soda, other than the unsweetened varieties like flavored club soda, the sweetness of the drink almost knocked her over. She quickly set the drink down and accepted the bowl of potatoes and carrots from her father. She eagerly dished up her plate with the vegetables, ready to get the taste of the soda from her mouth before she decided she liked it. Her mom really was enjoying this way too much. And Will was completely oblivious to the entire situation. He had no idea the lengths she'd gone to just to avoid sugar. The years of saying no, thank you, and rejecting cravings. Her mom thought it was all silly, but Layla loved to run, and eating sugar had only made her body perform at a lower rate. Will was a perfect gentleman throughout the rest of dinner. He added the perfect amount of touching and loving caresses. By the end of the night, Layla felt the lines of reality beginning to blur. But she knew it wasn't real. None of it was. They were only acting, and none of Will's loving touches were coming from his heart. It was only a show. But every time he brushed her hair back from her face or caressed her hand, sparks flew, and she found herself pushing his shoulder playfully and giving him flirty smiles. Eventually, she wasn't so sure it was fake anymore. Her mom cut into the chocolate cake and handed Will a slice. He took his fork and gave Layla the first taste from his plate. She locked eyes with him as the delicious flavor of creamy dark chocolate exploded in her mouth. She closed her eyes and moaned. How could she have denied herself this amazing treat for so many years? It was every bit as good as she remembered. She opened her eyes to see her mom watching her with a big smile. And for a moment, she wasn't angry at her mom anymore. She couldn't quite remember why she'd been so angry. Her mom just wanted her to have the good things in life. Maybe she didn't necessarily know the right way to go about it, but she really did have good intentions. Layla had fought her for so long. She'd been so stubborn. She looked at Will, who was also watching her. Was it the same with him? Was he only giving her all those speeding tickets because he wanted to keep her safe? Maybe he wasn't so bad after all. With that realization, a burden lifted from her shoulders, and she felt that she could breathe a bit better, a bit more freely. Was this what chocolate cake did for people? She looked around the dining room. Everyone looked so happy. She'd spent so many years denying herself this happiness. And for what? To fit in a size 2? To hit her lowest time ever on a 5K? Those weren't necessarily bad things, but maybe it was okay to allow herself to indulge once in a while. She glanced over at Will. Did that include him? Was it okay to let herself indulge? She looked up at him and found him looking back at her with tenderness in his eyes. Her eyes lingered on his lips, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to kiss him again. Would it be amazing again? Or was the last time only a fluke? Just the two of them, caught up in the unexpectedness of it all. What would an intentional kiss with Will Vance be like? One where they weren't playing games. Her parents collected their dirty plates and took them into the kitchen, and Layla leaned into Will. His eyes locked with hers, and they were only inches apart. Will's eyes moved down to her mouth, and she thought for sure he was going to break the no-kissing rule. But, for once, she didn't care at all. The pull to be with him, to feel his lips on hers, was overwhelming. She craved it, needed it. Her father came in from the kitchen, interrupting their moment. "Will, would you like to come see my Mustang in the garage? I've been restoring it off and on for the past 10 years. The moment lost, and her nerves on edge, Layla did the unexpected. She grabbed her glass of cherry Coke and took a big swallow.
Chapter 5. Will tossed and turned in bed all night. The next morning he went into work and couldn't think of anything but Layla. He needed to kiss her once more. Blast her no-kissing rule. She'd been such a tease last night. He thought for sure she was going to kiss him. And maybe she would have, if her dad hadn't interrupted their moment. He struggled to concentrate all morning. Finally, he gave up and made some excuse about needing to work Ryan's case. He drove to Fresh Cut Flowers and frowned at seeing Chris through the glass doors, talking to Layla. Didn't the guy take a hint? Did he hit on married women too? Will pulled open the door to the shop, the chime tinkling as he entered. A coffee and a bagel sat on the counter between them. Had Chris brought her breakfast? That guy had a lot of nerve. "Layla, I really am sorry for my behavior at the park on Saturday," Will overheard Chris saying as he came in behind him. "I didn't mean to upset you at all. I hope you can forgive me. I really don't want to lose you as a friend." "Chris, we aren't friends. I thought I made that abundantly clear at the park. And we especially aren't friends because you aren't respecting my wishes. I told you, I don't want you to approach me. And here you are, standing in my flower shop. I think it's best you leave now." "I just need you to explain why you don't want to be friends," Chris argued. "You'd better do what Layla asked, Chris," Will interrupted. You need to leave right now. Chris turned to see him like he hadn't even noticed he was there, and his face paled.
Will!
Layla's face brightened when she saw him. He really hated that no kissing rule right now, because he was dying to give her a nice, long, slow kiss right in front of this jerk, to give him a more direct message. Instead, he circled around the counter to her and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into his chest protectively. Are you okay? He murmured into her hair. He breathed in her scent and sighed. She smelled amazing, like frosted vanilla cupcakes. She pulled back and whispered, I'm fine. I told you. I can handle myself. I know. I'm just checking. She pulled him back into another hug. Thanks, Will. You're good to me. For a moment, he wondered if she really meant that, or if she was only putting on a show for Chris. Who was he kidding? This was the girl who told him she didn't do relationships under any circumstance. The bell on the door tinkled, and Will turned to see that Chris had just left. Layla let out a sigh of relief.
I'm so glad he's gone. He's really freaking me out.
She swept the coffee and bagel from the counter and dropped them both into the garbage can.
If I eat this, I'm gonna be sick.
I don't trust that guy. He could have laced your food with something.
I wouldn't put it past him.
I need to get going. I just stopped to say hi, Will said. Promise me you'll be on the watch for any sketchy behaviors Chris may exhibit, okay?
Okay. Thank you, Will.
Goodbye, Will said as he opened the door to leave.
Hey, wait a second,
Layla said before he stepped outside. He turned back to look at her.
My parents were wondering if you wanted to hike the Appalachian Trail with us this weekend. I think they like you.
It warmed Will's heart to hear it. I like them too. Tell them I'd be happy to go hiking with you guys. How hard was it going to be for him when it was time to break off their fake engagement? He crossed the street and stopped by Accounting Solutions to check in with Ryan.
Hey, Chief Vance,
Ryan said, standing and rounding his desk to greet him with a handshake.
I've meant to reach out to you. I discovered that the list of clients I sent you was actually outdated. I clicked on the wrong one when I was emailing the attachment.
He lifted a paper from a side table and handed it to Will.
Here's the updated list.
A name jumped out to Will from the top of the list. Chris Trapp is one of your clients?
Yep, we just brought him on. We've been working with him a lot lately. It's a pretty involved process to onboard a new client. He's been in and out of here quite a bit.
Do you think he knew anything about the money?
No, I trust my employees fully. And why would they feel the need to break in? They all have keys and access to the money. But one of them might have put the money away in front of another client who may have come in. Joe is off today. When he gets back into work tomorrow, we can ask him the names of all the clients who may have witnessed the money changing hands. Or who may have seen that there was a cash deposit written on a receipt or something. I'm not sure how this person would have known about the cash, but clearly someone heard something. And unfortunately, I don't have a security camera. I'll for sure be getting one now, though.
Will left Ryan's office with a new list in hand, with the new information that Chris was a client. He felt a renewed vigor to catch the person responsible for the theft. Will met up with Layla outside her parents' home Saturday morning for their hike on the Appalachian Trail. Her parents were starting to believe that they were a legitimate couple, and Will himself was starting to wonder if it might not be such a bad idea as he originally thought. They piled into her parents' car, and Will and Layla sat in the back seat together. She reached out and took his hand, and he had to remind himself that it wasn't real. She didn't really want to hold his hand. It was part of the facade. He knew what he'd signed up for from the beginning, but it was starting to get harder to pretend. Because somewhere in the hidden depths of his heart, he was beginning to realize that he wanted it to be real between them. At least on some level. Because for him, on whatever level that was, it was real. It had been from the very beginning, back in 7th grade when she put her arms around his neck and her lips to his. He could tell that her mom had invited him along because she wanted to push them together even faster. She seemed obsessed with him and had been grilling him with questions the entire time. He didn't mind. He was just glad that she'd lost interest in Chris Trapp. The guy was a complete loser. He didn't like the idea of him being anywhere near Layla. He'd interviewed the guy, and Chris had told him that he'd been at home the night of the robbery. But Chris lived alone, and there was no one to corroborate his story. "You didn't notice Chris at the tavern the night of the robbery, did you?" Will asked Layla.
He might have been there, but I don't remember seeing him.
"I don't remember him being there that night either," Will said. The rest of the car ride to the trail was spent with Layla's parents asking Will more questions. The time passed quickly, and Will spoke easily of his life and interests. As he spoke, he could see Layla softening up to him even more as he opened up. She seemed to enjoy talking to him just as much as her parents did, and by the time they got to the trail, she was the one asking the questions. He didn't mind. Once they hit the trail, her parents went ahead a bit, leaving them alone together. They hiked amongst the towering trees wrapped in yellows and oranges and the babbling stream that ran near the trail. Birds chirped happily overhead, and the air smelled fresh and clean. It was one of the most beautiful places Will had ever seen. "You guys have been asking me all the questions," Will said. "I have a question for you."
Okay,
Layla said.
I suppose that's only fair.
"Why have you sworn off relationships?"
Oh, you're playing dirty now.
"You don't have to answer it if you feel uncomfortable," Will said.
No, it's okay. I can talk about it. It's just a little intense.
"I'm the chief of police. I can handle intense," Will joked.
Good point.
Layla let out a loud sigh.
When I was 18, I went off to college and got married right away. I was so young and naive. The guy I married was horrible and abusive to me. It ended in divorce after 6 months. I have zero ability to tell if a guy is shady, I swear.
"I'm sorry that happened."
It's okay. It's in the past. But I still have terrible judgment. My experience with marriage was so horrible that I promised myself right after my divorce that I would never be abused like that again. And I knew the only way to make sure that never happened was to stay single. I just don't trust myself.
"I think you have better judgment than you give yourself credit for," Will said.
What do you mean?
"You saw Chris for who he was and stood up to him just fine."
That's true, but he was being obviously creepy. I still let guys pull the wool over my eyes. I'm so afraid another guy will come along and trick me into being in another abusive relationship.
"Unfortunately, there are abusers out there. You just need to work on learning the red flags," Will said. He spent the next several minutes teaching her about warning signs to look for.
You really are an expert on this,
Layla said. "I'm the chief of police. You see a lot of stuff in this line of work. Part of our training is to be able to read people. I can tell you've worked really hard to protect yourself, though. You really should give yourself more credit."
I've worked hard to get this way. I even took a self-defense class. I don't want another jerk to lay hands on me.
"Good for you. I know about an excellent martial arts class in town if you're interested."
Actually, I am, Layla said. Text me the information when we get back.
When they got to the top of the mountain they'd been steadily climbing, the trail narrowed.
Ever been here before?
Layla said. "Nope," Will replied.
It gets pretty steep in some parts.
Will swallowed. He was terrified of heights. He tried to face his fear by going rock climbing, but it never seemed to get better, no matter how often he put himself near the edge of a cliff. As they got higher, the trail became more rugged, until they were hiking single file and climbing over several jagged outcroppings of rocks. Will caught a view of the valley below, and the old familiar panic seized him once again. The further they went, the worse it got. His legs began to shake, and the world started to spin.
"Will, are you okay?"
Layla asked. She had gotten a bit ahead on the trail and turned back to check on him. He shook his head. He could feel his cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'll be okay. Just give me a minute." He put his head between his knees and took some deep breaths. "I'm deathly afraid of heights," he admitted through gritted teeth. "I've been in situations way worse than this, but for some reason, it's hitting me especially hard today." Layla sat next to him and put a hand on his back.
"You've got this. You can conquer this."
He took a few more deep breaths and then stood once more.
"Great! You're doing great."
Layla's voice gave him the courage he needed to face his fear. He stood and climbed across the rugged outcropping, and the trail stayed rugged like that for the next 30 minutes of hiking. At last, they came to a rock that overlooked the forested hills below. The view was incredible. Layla's parents were already there waiting for them.
"You two made it,"
Layla's mom crooned.
"Isn't this the most beautiful place you've ever seen?"
She stretched her arms out like the world was hers. Will chuckled to himself. The woman really was quite the character.
"Can I get a picture of the two of you? It's quite the accomplishment to make it this far. We have to document it." "Sure,"
Layla said. She took Will's hand and led him to the edge. Will took a deep breath and tried to keep from thinking how far he'd fall if he happened to tumble over the side of the cliff.
"Come on,"
Mrs. Bowen called, holding up her cell phone for a picture.
"Give her a kiss. You made it this far. You might as well celebrate."
Will froze. He looked at Layla, and she gave him the slightest of nods. Permission. He licked his lips, and his pulse raced for an entirely different reason now. He pulled Layla toward him. Tendrils of hair had escaped from her ponytail. He swept it back from her forehead, and she looked up into his eyes. Her big brown eyes were so vulnerable, and she looked terribly fragile at that moment. Was it possible that her heart was as much on the line as his was? He could feel her trembling beneath his grasp, and he pulled her closer as he lowered his mouth to hers. Once again, fireworks exploded in his head as his mouth met hers. She kissed him back, her mouth moving perfectly in sync with his. It was like she understood exactly what he wanted out of a kiss and knew the perfect way to deliver it to him. He wanted more from her and knew he was in trouble. This kiss had pushed him over the edge. He was falling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. It was way too late for that.
"That's beautiful,"
Mrs. Bowen said. She sounded ecstatic, because to her, clearly that kiss was anything but fake. She was sold on their romance. He just wasn't so sure Layla was, and that was the part that had him worried. He pulled away from her and studied her face to gauge her reaction. But Layla was giving him nothing. She turned away from him, taking a big drink from her water bottle.
"Ready to get going, guys?"
she said, like nothing had just happened. Disappointment struck his heart hard, but he fought to hide it. "Yep, let's head out." He took a turn drinking from his own water bottle to hide his displeasure. For the rest of the hike, he stayed next to Layla's dad and kept him engaged in a deep conversation about fixing up old cars. Layla stayed behind them with her mother. They didn't even speak until they got back to the parking lot. By then it was getting dark, and they climbed into the back seat together. They didn't speak as Mr. Bowen cranked up the engine and pulled from the parking lot. He wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion or if Layla was pulling away, but she was still being awfully quiet. After a few minutes, Layla fell asleep beside him, and her sleeping form fell against him. He let her lean against his shoulder. He wondered how long it would last. Thanksgiving was rapidly approaching, and they'd be that much closer to Christmas when his time with Layla would be over. And he wasn't sure how he felt about that.
Chapter 6. Layla filled her plate with macaroni and cheese and a green salad. The church was putting on a luncheon after the Sunday service. She'd invited Will to come, but he said he might be a bit late.
Her head had been spinning ever since their toe-curling kiss on the Appalachian Trail. But she'd let it go too far. She should have made an excuse, stopped him before he kissed her. But her mom was standing right there, expecting them to kiss. What was she supposed to say? She had been going over it in her head repeatedly. She made the no-kissing rule for a reason. Her first kiss with Will when they were in 7th grade had overwhelmed her. She'd felt too much too soon with him. It was why she'd broken things off with him so quickly when he kept following her around. She was young and hadn't known how to handle so many strong emotions. Then, years later, she'd kissed him impulsively when he pulled her over. She hadn't thought the kiss would be like it had in 7th grade, earth-shatteringly powerful. So many years had passed, and she chalked up the emotions she felt back then as teenage hormones. But their kiss in front of the church was just as strong as their kiss had been in 7th grade, if not even stronger. It had completely caught her off guard. Their kiss on the trail had been the best of all. It had brought her closer to him physically and emotionally. She felt herself falling, and she had to do what she could to stop it. But she didn't know how. She wasn't sure she could stop it. Her sister Nikki, younger by 2 years, was in line beside her. She and Nikki had stayed close throughout the years and had survived their mom's intense helicopter parenting. Nikki had somehow managed to avoid marriage thus far. It really was a miracle considering how badly their mom wanted grandbabies. Their mom was always talking about how their eggs were drying up. But seeing how both girls were still in their 20s, it was hardly the case. Layla's mom had wanted several children, but she'd run into fertility problems after Nikki was born and ended up with a hysterectomy instead of more children. So now, she was chomping at the bit for grandchildren. Layla understood it. Mrs. Bowen watched all her friends doting on their grandbabies while her arms stayed empty. Nikki had chosen a career instead of marriage and children. She led group therapy at the local hospital with patients who were contemplating suicide. It was an incredible career, and she had helped to change hundreds of lives. Layla filled a cup with ice water from the water pitcher. "Where are you sitting, Layla?" someone said from behind her. She turned to see Chris standing there, and she frowned. "You're not sitting with me, Chris."
Whoa, why do you have to be so rude? I was just trying to be friendly.
I told you not to approach me.
If you would just talk to me, then I wouldn't have to keep approaching you. I just need you to answer that one question. I deserve an answer. It's only fair.
Fair? I don't owe you any kind of explanation. I don't owe you friendship either. In fact, I don't owe you anything at all.
Chris's expression hardened. Listen, if you don't tell me why you don't want to be friends, it's not going to be good for you. Shock jolted through her.
Are you threatening me?
I just need you to answer that question, then I'll leave you alone.
I'm engaged to the chief of police. Do you have mush for brains? If you keep stalking me, it's not going to be good for you. Go away and stay away.
She walked away from him to her family's table and took a seat next to her sister.
Layla, what's wrong?
Her mother asked.
You're as white as a sheet and shaking all over. What did Chris just say to you? He just threatened me. And how did you respond? He looks furious.
Nikki said from the seat next to Layla.
I told him the truth. If he can't handle it, that's his problem. Good for you,
Nikki said. Will pulled out the chair on the other side of her. Did you just tell Chris off? Layla relayed the conversation she'd had with Chris to the entire table, including her parents. A look of fury crossed Will's features as she got to the part of the story where Chris had threatened her. This is a serious problem. If this gets much worse, you may need to file a protective order against Chris. Her mom shook her head.
I was mistaken about that young man. I can't believe the way he's treating you, Layla. It's like he's going crazy,
Layla said.
I agree, Will said. He's clearly unstable. I'll be keeping a close eye on him. And if it would help, I can have some patrol cars keep a watch over your house.
That would make me feel much safer,
Layla said, scooting closer to him, breathing in his woodsy scent. He responded by putting his arm around her and kissing the top of her head tenderly. Just being near him made her feel safer, actually. Throughout the rest of dinner, Will kept her distracted with funny stories from his years as a police officer, and by the time the luncheon was over, she'd relaxed quite a bit and had even started joking around again. They threw their trash away, and then Will walked Layla to her car.
Still driving the Corvette?
Layla flashed him a smile.
You know it.
Just don't speed.
She giggled.
Are you going to give me another ticket?
Not unless you speed.
I'll try to be a good girl. Just for you.
Layla.
Will took her hands in his.
All joking aside, I'd like to take you on a real date. I know there's a lot going on with Chris, and I'm not saying I want to rush into anything, but I want to see what a real date with you could be like. Is that something you'd be open to trying? It might help you get your mind off of things.
Layla thought for a moment. Fear swirled in her belly. She'd been so resistant to the idea of any kind of real romance for such a long time. It was hard to even let her mind go there. But, wait a minute. This was Will, not some random guy from the bar. Well, technically, he was a guy from the bar, but he was the police chief. The mayor himself appointed him. Her dad had been friends with the mayor for years. Not to mention the fact that she'd known Will since they both attended Maple Creek Elementary. She looked into his hopeful eyes, but behind the hope, she sensed something else. Worry. She hadn't noticed before how deeply concerned he was for her safety. It was actually kind of sweet to know he cared so much, and it warmed her heart to see it.
Yes, Will. I'll go on a real date with you. When do you want to go?
What are you doing for the rest of the day?
Nothing. The shop is closed on Sunday, so I have the rest of the day available. What did you have in mind?
How do you feel about the art museum?
A wide smile spread across her face.
Are you kidding me? It's my favorite. I always get so much inspiration every time I go.
She felt giddy just thinking about it.
I was hoping you'd say that. You okay with taking my car?
Will asked.
Sure,
Layla said. She couldn't help but feel relieved that he was offering to drive. After her mountain of tickets, driving in front of Will would be stressful, to say the least, and she'd had enough stress for one day. She was ready to lose herself to the joy of viewing the art at the museum. Will drove to the century-old mansion on the outskirts of town, where the art museum was located.
I love this place,
Layla breathed as she stepped out of the car, looking up at the neoclassical brick structure with white pillars.
There's something so magical about it.
The trees stretched overhead, shading the lawn in front of the mansion. Will reached for her hand, and she placed her hand in his. She told herself not to overthink it. Just go with it. It was one date. Pretty innocent. Harmless, really. Nothing to get worked up about. She just had to remind herself to breathe, because she kept forgetting, and that was a bad thing. Not breathing could lead to something like fainting, and that could get awkward pretty fast. They walked up the steps of the building, hand in hand, and Will opened the door for them. The inside of the building was covered in rich, glossy wood. He paid for both of them to enter the museum, and then he led her past the ticket stand at the entrance. That was when she began to relax. She was in her element.
You seem really happy here,
Will said. He was observant.
What are your favorite paintings?
Will asked.
Definitely the paintings of flowers.
Why is that?
He asked. She thought for a minute. I've always loved paint and floral arrangements.
It was what made me want to open a flower shop. Arranging flowers is an art itself. It's just a different type of canvas.
I can see that, Will said. Did you study art in college?
I did. I majored in business and minored in art. Then I worked myself to the bone to be able to finally own a flower shop. Starting a business is no joke. It takes a lot of hard work and dedication. Even then, a lot of people don't end up making it.
What do you think helped you do so well with your business?
Will asked. I didn't get involved with anyone. I just focused on my business and nothing else. There was no guy to disappoint when I was working 80-hour work weeks. No one expected me to cook or clean.
But would it have been so bad to have a guy there to cheer you on as you found your success?
I wouldn't have been able to give him anything back. He would have deserved better.
And what about now? Are you too busy for a relationship?
Layla thought about it for a moment. I'm definitely not as busy as I used to be. I have employees to help me share the workload.
She eyed him.
Why do you ask?
Surely he wasn't dropping hints. She'd been more than clear with him about her feelings on relationships. He shrugged.
No reason. I just want to understand where you stood on the topic.
You mean you're interested in pursuing a relationship with me?
She said. Might as well get to the point. She was sick of tiptoeing around the topic.
I'm going to be completely honest with you, Layla. I have feelings for you. Every time we've kissed, it's cost me sleep for the next several nights. I know you're very clear on your stance on relationships, but I still feel like I need to be honest with you about my feelings. You made a huge impact on me when we kissed in 7th grade, and that hasn't changed, even after all these years. Only that those feelings now go much deeper. I'm in love with you, Layla. I can't keep pretending. It's too hard for me. One way or another, we have to stop this silly game. Whether that means we stage our breakup earlier than planned, or we never stage one at all, and we just let this all become a reality. I just know it hurts to be near you, but not really with you.
Layla's heart swelled in her chest at Will's declaration. She cared deeply for him, too. But that was the problem. She was teetering dangerously close to the edge, and she was about to fall. She had to do damage control while she still could.
I care about you a lot, Will. I like you as a person, and I've had a lot of fun pretending to be engaged to you. But nothing has changed for me. I don't do relationships, and neither should you. You still need to heal from your divorce.
Maybe it would help for me to explain to you what happened with my ex.
Okay, that's fair.
Jessie was a nurse at the Maple Creek Hospital for the head surgeon. She worked very closely with him. Eventually, she started sleeping with him. But I want you to understand that Jessie and I had fallen out of love well before she ever cheated on me. We'd grown apart. I was focused on my career, and I didn't give her the attention she deserved. I take full responsibility for that. So although I talk about being fresh out of a nasty divorce, the truth of the matter is, the worst of it happened long ago. I've had a long time to come to terms with the fact that my marriage was dead. Am I happy that Jessie betrayed our marriage vows? No. Am I devastated? Not really. Because my heart isn't and wasn't with her anyway. But at the same time, I learned a valuable lesson. I will never let my career take precedence over a future relationship.
What made you decide that a relationship is back on the table for you?
Will looked directly at Layla.
You.
Chills ran down her spine. What did I do?
You're beautiful and vibrant and funny. You don't take life too seriously.
Ha! You'd be surprised. I can definitely take life way too seriously.
Like the fact that she didn't want to be in a relationship because of her lack of trust in humanity as a whole. That counted as taking life too seriously. But she wasn't ready to give that up. She just couldn't. The fear of landing herself in another abusive relationship was too strong.
Layla, You've drawn me in, and I can't stop thinking about you.
I don't know what to say.
Say you'll go on another date with me. I'm not saying we have to move quickly or anything. I just want to see what step 2 might look like for us.
Will said.
You just said that you're in love with me. That's not exactly step 2. That's like step 100 or something. Will, I like you, and I completely respect your feelings as valid. But I'm just not in that place. So I stand by my decision. I don't do relationships. Period.
The vulnerable look on Will's face changed to the hardened look he usually wore when he wrote her a ticket.
I understand,
he said in a curt, businesslike manner.
You're entitled to that decision.
He was trying to cover up his pain, but it was oozing past the mask he'd hastily slapped on. She turned away from him to study a painting of a farmhouse that had always intrigued her. But she couldn't focus on anything but Will's pain. They walked through the rest of the museum in silence, and then Will drove her back to the church parking lot where she'd left her car. They exchanged still goodbyes, and Layla traveled home. She sat in her empty house and listened to the clock ticking and the sound of the heater kicking in. Was this the life she'd signed up for? Emptiness and loneliness? It had never seemed that way before. But that was before Will had come into her life, and she didn't want to go back to the way it had been. But she couldn't risk ending up in another failed marriage. She just couldn't. She knew she was the type to attract an abuser. There was no way around that. There was no hope left for her. She'd come to terms with that fact years ago. But she still felt terrible, and she wasn't sure she would ever feel okay again.
Chapter 7. Early the next morning, Will woke to the sound of his phone ringing. Hello?
Will, this is Layla. I told my parents last night that we broke up. Are you home right now? I want to drop off your grandmother's ring.
Pain seared through Will's heart. I still don't understand why it has to be this way.
I can't give you what you're looking for. You deserve someone with a heart to give. I locked mine up years ago. So while it was fun while it lasted, it doesn't make sense anymore to continue this fake relationship. I think we accomplished what we set out to do. My mom won't be bothering me about getting married for a long time.
Bitterness lanced through Will. I'm glad you accomplished your goal. At least I was of some use to you.
Well, I didn't mean it like that. I really like you, and I had a lot of fun. I just can't take our relationship to someplace real. I hope you can understand that.
I understand you perfectly.
Good. What's your address? I want to get this ring back to you.
I'll text it to you. I'll be leaving within the next hour, so you'll have to get here quickly. They hung up, and Will rolled out of bed and took a quick shower. He toweled off and dressed, and then fixed himself a cup of coffee. As he stirred in his creamer, his German shepherd, Bud, barked. He glanced out the window to see the Corvette pulling up in his driveway. He lived in a secluded cottage in the woods next to the river. He loved his privacy, but lately it had felt more lonely than private. He'd made the mistake of allowing himself to daydream what it would be like to share his home with Layla. Now he knew that would never happen. He heard the car door slam, and he went to the front door to greet her. He swung open the door and took in her gorgeous appearance. She was dressed for work and had her hair half pulled back again with those tendrils framing her face. It hurt him to see her looking so beautiful, so ready to conquer the world, one bouquet of flowers at a time. She spent her life sending flowers to people to cheer them up, but there she was, breaking his heart.
Hi,
she said. She removed the ring and dropped it into his palm.
I never meant to hurt you, Will. I should have known better. I'm really sorry.
I'm sorry, too. But he was sorry for a different reason. He was sorry that she couldn't see that she deserved happiness. She deserved to learn to trust again. But that wasn't a gift he could give her. Only she could discover that for herself.
Goodbye, Will.
I'm sure I'll see you around on the road, Will said, in a lame attempt to lighten the mood, despite his own heartbreak.
Well, it won't be to pull me over. I've learned my lesson about speeding.
Somehow, he doubted that. But he didn't have it in his heart to pull her over anymore. He'd let another cop take over that duty. Will sat in a chair by the river just outside his home. He'd spent the past week renovating his bathroom after work. He had to do something to get his mind off of Layla. But now that he'd finished the renovation, he found himself with extra time on his hands, and he didn't know what to do with himself. So he sat in one of his chairs and stared at the river rushing past. Bud sat next to him, and Will reached out to pet his soft head. He scratched behind Bud's ears, and the dog wagged his tail. Will smiled. Everything was so easy for Bud. All he had to worry about was when he'd get his next meal. Will reflected on his divorce from Jessie. Whenever he thought about her, he just felt emptiness. He'd cried his tears over her years ago. He had nothing left in his heart for her, so there was nothing she could do to hurt him. But Layla, she was everything he'd ever looked for in a wife. She was spontaneous and fun, witty, intelligent, and beautiful. He just wished there was a way he could show her he wasn't one of the bad guys. Now that he'd spent so much time with Layla, he knew how full life could be with her in it. His emptiness was overwhelming him. His phone rang next to him. He didn't recognize the number. Hello?
Will, it's Mrs. Bowen.
Her voice sounded panicked. Is everything all right? He asked.
It's Layla. I think she's been abducted.
Will's heart raced, but he forced himself to allow his police training to take over. What makes you say that?
She was helping me with a fundraiser at church, and she ran out to her car to get some art supplies. She never came back, and when I went out to see what was taking her so long, I found a car in the parking lot with the doors hanging open.
Will jumped from his chair and raced to the house with Bud on his heels to get the keys to his police cruiser. He had a good idea who may have taken Layla, and he knew exactly where to check first.
Chapter 8. Chris forced Layla to sit on his couch. A wave of nausea rolled over her when he caressed her cheek before removing her blindfold. She pushed his hands away from her with her wrists still tied together, and he said, Now, I don't want to hurt you. As long as you behave yourself, we can have a wonderful evening. Layla looked around and saw candlelight flickering over a table with a white lace tablecloth. A bottle of champagne and 2 champagne flutes sat beside a basket of rolls, plates, and silverware. On the couch next to her sat a strapless purple satin evening gown and a pair of black pumps. You look the loveliest in purple. I even got your shoe size right. I checked your shoes when you took 'em off to get in the duck pond. Layla's skin crawled. Did that mean he'd been planning her kidnapping since they were at the pond? Layla looked around to find an exit, but Chris had a gun tucked into the waistband of his dress pants. The same gun he'd used to force her to get into the trunk of his car and place the blindfold over her eyes before tying her wrists together. If she wanted to escape, she would have to get creative. But right now, she was completely out of ideas. So, you want me to get dressed for dinner? She asked, working hard to keep her voice from wavering. She just needed to stay calm and go along with what he said, so he didn't flip out and do something to hurt her before she could find a way to escape. Yes, you can use the guest bathroom to get changed. He cut the ropes from her wrists. Okay. Layla stood and picked up the dress and shoes. No fast moves, understood? Chris had the gun pointed at her again. She swallowed back her fear. Understood. She went into the guest bathroom and gripped the countertop as she looked at her terrified reflection. She changed into the purple dress, taking as long as she possibly could. She hoped her mom would come looking for her and alert help. Her phone had a GPS tracker on it, and she hoped Chris hadn't figured out how to disable it when he took it away from her. Her mom was always insisting on knowing her whereabouts, and for once, Layla was glad she'd given her mom that one indulgence. With a swipe of a finger, her mom could see exactly where she was. "Hurry up, my love, our dinner's getting cold," Chris called through the door. Layla fought to slow her rapid breaths. The man was clearly deranged. "Just play along," she told herself. "Patience, dear. I only want to look perfect for you." Eventually, Chris began to grow impatient enough that Layla didn't dare push him further, for fear of what he might do. She twisted open the doorknob and saw him sitting at the table. The candles had burned down considerably, and Chris looked thoroughly irritated. Layla had to find another way to stall. She didn't know what horrors Chris had planned once they'd eaten dinner. The not knowing was the worst part. She had no idea what he was capable of. But given the fact that he'd kidnapped her and set up this creepy dinner, odds were, he had much worse things planned for her. She walked over to the bookshelf lined with leather-bound classics. "What lovely books you have here. Have you read 'em all?" "Yes, several times each." She traced her fingers over the bindings. The logo of her flower shop caught her eye. Tucked into the end of the bookshelf, next to a copy of Treasure Island, was a VCR tape with one of her labels stuck to the end. She pulled it from the shelf. It was the surveillance tape from her store. That meant Chris must have broken into her store and taken the money from Ryan at Accounting Solutions. Why else would her tape be here? Put that back. Chris's breath was on her bare shoulder now, and she shuddered. Her hand began shaking, and she pressed her sweaty palm against the satin dress. She had to think fast if she was going to survive this situation. "I said, put it back." The cold metal of the open barrel of the gun pressed into her back. Layla's breath caught in her throat. She was out of options. Why had she been stupid enough to pull the tape from the shelf? She should have just pretended she hadn't seen anything. Her mind raced as she thought of ways to survive. She slowly placed the tape back on the shelf, next to the copy of Treasure Island. She needed to get him to let his guard down, and then she could get the gun away from him somehow. Maybe the answer was to give him exactly what he wanted. If she was going to survive this, she was going to need to dust off her acting skills. She dug deep down and pulled out her inner flirt. "Calm down, Chris." She turned around to face him with a coy smile. "I won't tell anyone your secret. Now, why don't you show me what you fixed us for dinner?" He relaxed visibly and led her to the table. He tucked his gun back into his waistband. "Aren't you going to pull out my chair?" she asked. "Of course." He pulled out her chair, and she sat gracefully. "Thank you, Chris." She smiled at him, and he seemed dazzled. Good. He was buying it. But then he frowned. "Why are you being so nice all of a sudden?" He eyed her suspiciously. "You think I'm that stupid? That I don't know what you're trying to do?" Think fast. Think fast. "No, I don't think that at all. I think you're a very smart person. I mean, look what you've been able to do with your business. I have a lot of respect for someone who works hard and builds a business from the ground up." "Oh, but I've had plenty of help along the way. Several loans, so to speak. I plan to pay them all back, of course. I don't actually believe in stealing." So that was how he was able to own so many properties. "You mean the money from Accounting Solutions? You're saying that was a loan?" "Not in the traditional sense of the word, but yes." How many times had he stolen money? The way he was talking, It seemed like Ryan wasn't the first person he'd stolen from. You see, I'm doing a good thing for the community. I provide housing at a much lower rate than my competitors, and because of the nature of how I get my money, I'm able to do that. In the long run, I'm better in the world. I'm just doing it my way. Did he hear himself? He thought it was okay to rob people so he could invest in properties and then eventually offer cheaper rent to families? But what about the innocent people like Ryan who had money stolen? It was like he'd read her mind, because he said, I know you probably think it's wrong, but I plan to pay back all my creditors, including Ryan. So you see, no harm done. No harm done? He couldn't just make up rules like that. It was like the guy wasn't grounded in reality. And who knew what he would do to her next? If he was confessing his crimes to her, that couldn't be a good sign. She had to act fast to protect herself, because the situation was about to spin out of control. She eyed the gun he'd laid on the table so he could butter a roll. It was now or never. She reached forward and grabbed the bottle of champagne from the table. She swung it around and hit him hard, breaking the bottle against the side of his head. He dropped from his chair to the floor, out cold. She tore the sash from her dress and used it as a rope to tie his hands together behind his back. Then, she picked up the gun from the table, stepped back, and kept the gun pointed at him in case he began to stir. The front door burst open, and Will shouted, Police! Drop your weapon! Wait, Layla? Layla dropped the gun, and it clattered to the floor. Will rushed in the room, flanked by several other police officers. Are you okay? Will asked her. She collapsed into his arms, the room spinning. Relief surged through her. She held onto him like an anchor in a furious storm. I'm so glad you're here, she said, into the shirt of his police uniform. The terror of the situation she'd just experienced still hadn't fully hit her. She recognized that. It would take time for that to sink in. But she wasn't going to worry about that now. For now, she was safe, and that was what mattered. And she had Will right here for when she needed him most. The officers handcuffed Chris's unconscious body, and paramedics rushed into the room to attend him. They asked Layla if she needed any treatment, but she shook her head. I'm not hurt, just a little freaked out. Layla gathered her belongings, snatching her cell phone from the countertop where Chris had left it, and left the house. Her mother rushed to greet her on the street outside. Thank goodness for that GPS app, her mother said through tears. I'm so glad you're okay. Why are you dressed like that? She scowled. Chris made me wear this stupid dress. Well, we're going to go home and burn it in the fire pit in the backyard. Will walked past them with Chris in handcuffs on a stretcher. Did you hear that? Mrs. Bowen called to Chris, who was beginning to wake up. We're going to burn your creepy dress. Onyx pulled up to the curb and rushed out of her car. Layla! Onyx ran to Layla's side and threw her arms around her. I'm glad you're okay. Will came up to them. Are you feeling up to coming down to the police station to fill out a report? We can go with you, Onyx said to Layla. Yes, of course we can, Layla's mom agreed. Layla looked at Will. Sure, I can give a report. By the way, you ought to check Chris's bookshelf next to his copy of Treasure Island. There's something that might help your other investigation. Something we've been looking for. Will gave her a quizzical look, but sent an officer to go check it out. You take it easy, he said to Layla. I'll see you at the station. He walked back to his police cruiser and began speaking to the officers gathered there. What happened between you two? Onyx asked. I broke it off. Why? Will's the perfect guy for you. Anyone can see that. I don't do relationships, Layla repeated. She was starting to feel like a broken record. You sure looked like you were doing a relationship up until you broke it off. And I would say you were pretty successful at it. I second that, Layla's mother piped up. Layla hadn't even noticed her mother was close enough to hear what they were saying. In the chaos of the moment, she'd forgotten entirely that her mom was standing there. For once, her mom wasn't hovering or trying to control the conversation. You and Will really were perfect together. Your father and I can't understand why you wouldn't want to be with him. Did he do something wrong? Layla thought about it for a moment. Had Will actually done anything wrong? No, I can't think of a single thing he's done wrong. Even when we were butting heads, he was always in the right. I was the one breaking the law. She knew she wasn't perfect. Sometimes he was stubborn and a stickler for the rules, but that didn't mean he was a bad guy. Her entire reasoning for staying single was that she tended to attract abusive men. But anyone could see that Will wasn't abusive. He had a heart of gold. So what are you so afraid of? Onyx asked. Nothing. There was nothing to be concerned about. I was just being stupid. And she was missing out on something wonderful for no good reason. Layla Bowen was officially an idiot. She wouldn't let herself enjoy the sweet things in life. And that was going to change. Starting with Will, if he still wanted her. Because he was the sweetest thing she'd ever tasted. Metaphorically and literally. When they got to the police station, Layla spent the necessary time filling out a detailed police report to Will. It was difficult to relay the story in its entirety to Will. She shuddered as she thought about how scared she'd been. I'm so glad it's over, she said to Will as he finished up the report. Will took her hands, right in front of her mother and Onyx. I was so worried about you, Layla. I don't know what I would have done if anything had happened to you. It warmed her heart more than she cared to admit to herself. She stood up, and he stood up with her. Can I give you a hug? She asked. Will's face softened into an expression of pure tenderness. Of course you can. She fell into his arms, and he pulled her tightly against his chest. Don't you ever get yourself into a crazy situation like that again. I told you I could take care of myself, she said with a grin. I know you can. But I'm really glad you're here too. And I'm really glad you showed up when you did. I know I can count on you when I need you. And that means a lot to me. It means a lot to me too, Will said. Sometimes I just need someone to hold me, you know? Layla said, snuggling deeper into his embrace. I know exactly what you mean, Will said. And she did need him. She didn't want to live without him anymore. It was nice to have him there for her. She saw that tonight. How nice had it been when he'd showed up just at the moment when she needed him most. He was a solid man she could rely on. He wouldn't take away from her strength. And she'd already established that Will wasn't a bad guy. So what was holding her back at this point? Nothing. She mulled over the word for a moment, allowing it to fully sink into her heart and what it meant for her. It was time for her to decide that she could do a relationship.
Chapter 9. Will cast his fishing line into the river as the sun dipped below the horizon. Bud panted happily at his side. A terrible smell wafted up, burning his nose. Oh, Bud, not again. He should have known better than to feed him that leftover pot roast that was spoiling in the fridge from last week. Bud was notorious for stinking it up after eating people food. In the distance, the wheels of a car crunched on the entrance to his gravel driveway. Will looked up and squinted through the trees and caught a flash of red. If he didn't know better, he'd say that was Layla's Nana's Corvette. He swallowed. Sure enough, Layla pulled up in the Corvette. She stepped out of it, looking like a dream come true in a black V-neck sweater and jeans. He shoved down the hope that began creeping up inside of him. Just because he saved the day when Layla had been abducted didn't mean she wanted him. The girl was too stubborn for that. But the look on her face as she walked toward him made him think otherwise. Her features were all softness and hope.
"Hi, Will," she said.
Huh.
"Is it okay if I talk to you for a minute?"
She looked down at Bud, who was wagging his tail at her.
"Oh, hey there, buddy."
She crouched down to his level to pet him.
"Oh, wow. What is that smell?"
She pinched her nose and took a step back. Sorry about that. I fed Bud people food again, and his stomach doesn't handle it so well.
"That is one stinky dog, but he sure looks happy about it. I bet he feels better after stinking it up."
He's been driving me nuts all day. You wouldn't want a dog sit by chance, would you? Will asked with a teasing grin.
"Nope, I'm good,"
Layla said. What did you want to talk about? Will asked.
"I'm here for a few reasons, but first I want to thank you for coming to save me from Chris."
It was my honor, and he wished he could be there to watch over her for the rest of his life, but he didn't dare speak that aloud.
"The other reason I'm here today is because I want to apologize to you."
You don't have anything to apologize for, Will insisted.
"Oh, but I do. You see, I was a hard-hearted knucklehead. I was a complete fool, and I need to apologize to you for that. You shouldn't have had to put up with me being so stupid. I know it's caused you a lot of extra pain and heartbreak."
What are you talking about? Will was genuinely confused.
"I'm saying I was stupid to be afraid of being in a real relationship, especially when that relationship is with a great guy like you. I wouldn't hesitate to match you up with my best friend, but I realized that I was hesitating to allow myself to enjoy something like the happiness that comes from a healthy relationship. Well, I'm tired of being dumb and scared. I'm ready to let my heart trust again. And I know you're one of the good ones. I've known it all along. I just didn't want to admit it to myself. I would have had to put myself out there again and trust that I wouldn't end up hurt and alone. Well, too bad. It's too late for that, because I'm in love with you. I realize that now. Being single just sounds like a miserable existence now that I recognize how I feel about you. I've missed our time together more than I can tell you."
She paused, pressing her lips together. A little crease formed between her eyebrows.
"Please say that you still love me."
Will pulled her into his arms and held her close to him, so close that their foreheads were touching. I still love you, and I will until the day I die, Layla Bowen. Would you like to be in a real relationship with me? Will asked.
"I would love to be in a real relationship with you."
I was hoping you would say that. Layla pulled back and wrinkled her nose.
"Ew, Bud, really? That's gross."
Will threw his head back and laughed, and in that moment, he knew everything was going to turn out all right. The end.
Epilogue. 6 months later. Onyx led Layla to the platform in front of the mirrors in her wedding dress shop. A gorgeous vintage lace wedding gown clung to Layla's curves, ornate beading draping over her shoulders. Onyx was determined to help Layla find the perfect dress for her big day. She was ecstatic that Layla and Will had worked things out and had decided on a June wedding. "How do you feel about this one?" Nikki asked. She and Josie were there to help Layla choose the perfect dress. Layla turned and examined the generous train behind her. "I really love it," Layla said, looking over her shoulder. "But I'm not sure about the open back on this one. It feels a bit too exposed." "The back does come down pretty low," Onyx agreed. "I have another vintage lace dress. It's like this one with the same shoulders, but it doesn't have the low-cut back, and it's a bit more flowy. Do you want to try that dress instead?" "Sure," Layla said, gathering the lace skirt and stepping off the platform. "Okay," Onyx said. "Change out of that one, and I'll bring you the other dress to try on." "Layla, I'll go with you to help you get it unzipped," Nikki offered.
Josie crossed her legs and scrolled through her phone while she waited. Layla headed to the dressing room with her sister, and Onyx went to the back of the store, where she knew she'd left the other dress. She'd just had a customer try it on last week who hadn't fit in it. She flipped through a few dresses before she found the one she was looking for. She hoped Layla would like it. She wanted so badly for her best friend to find the perfect dress. Will and Layla were perfect for each other. They balanced each other out. While she was sassy and free-spirited, he took life more seriously. He had to take life seriously. Busting the bad guys was no joke. And thank goodness for Will, especially with criminals like Chris Trapp around. She felt like she could sleep better at night, knowing Chris was behind bars. Onyx selected the dress and draped it over her arms. She walked back to Layla's dressing room and knocked on the door. "I have the dress for you." Nikki opened the door and took the gown from Onyx. "Awesome, thanks," she said. "Do you know if she picked a venue yet?" Josie asked when Onyx returned from the dressing room to wait for Layla to come out with the next dress. "Yes, they're getting married at the Whitmore house," Onyx said. "I heard Aubrey Wheaton is running the Whitmore house now that Natasha and Adam are married," Josie said. "That's right. Aubrey's doing a great job, too. Layla told me she's been easy to work with." Josie picked up a catalog with tuxes and suits. "Have they picked out what the guys are wearing yet?" "Yep, I'll show you." It was always easier getting the men dressed than the women. Onyx flipped through the catalog to the section with gray suits. She pointed to the page. "This one." Her stomach did a flip-flop inside her as she imagined Taylor Roberts dressed as the best man. She could just imagine how well he'd fill out that suit with his big muscles. As the maid of honor, she would be working closely with him. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She knew it shouldn't be a big deal, but she was ridiculously attracted to him, despite how crazy he made her feel. He was so arrogant, and his self-assured manner was like nails on a chalkboard to her. She wasn't sure how she was going to get through the wedding festivities with Taylor hanging around all the time. He'd come to the shop with Will and Layla to pick out the suits, and she'd found herself biting back rude, sarcastic remarks the entire time. Regardless of how she felt about Taylor, she owed it to Layla to behave herself. But Onyx knew it wasn't going to be easy. "What about the ties?" Josie asked. "The ties are going to match the bridesmaid dresses. Layla is waiting to pick those out until she chooses her dress, but I think she's decided on blush pink. I just have to work my magic and find dresses that won't make us all look like buffoons." "But isn't that what bridesmaid dresses are supposed to do? Make us look ridiculous so we don't upstage the bride?" Josie teased. "Not on my watch," Onyx insisted. "My goal is to make us all look fantastic." Because there was no way she wanted to look like a buffoon around Taylor, especially when she knew he was going to look flawless in that suit. She scolded herself for allowing herself to fantasize about Taylor again. She had to get a hold of herself, because if she was caught drooling over Taylor, she was going to look like a fool in front of everyone, and she couldn't have that. Layla walked from the dressing room, and Onyx gasped. The vintage lace gown fit Layla perfectly. Crystal beading adorned the empire waist, and the skirt swished loosely around her as she walked across the room. A slight train flowed behind. Onyx knew immediately when she saw Layla that they'd found the one. But she held back to allow Layla to come to that conclusion herself. Sure enough, when Layla stood on the platform, her face lit up, and Onyx knew she'd been right. "I think this is it," Layla said, her eyes glittering with the realization. It was a big moment every bride anticipated, to find the perfect dress, and this dress was indeed perfect for Layla. Onyx watched dreams come true every day for brides. It was why she'd opened her wedding dress shop. But would that moment ever come for Onyx? She'd been asking herself that question since she'd started her business. But she was beginning to lose hope that the magical day would ever come for her. And that thought broke her heart. Want to find out if Onyx ever gets her happily ever after? Buy Kiss Me Baby One More Time to keep reading. About the author. Cindy Ray Hale loves writing young adult contemporary romance and clean romance. She was born and raised in the hills of Tennessee and has moved all over the United States. She's finally settled down in a small town in the mountains of Western Virginia. Want to be the first to know about a sale or a new release for Cindy's books? Visit www.cindyrayhale.com to join her newsletter or follow Cindy Ray Hale on Twitter. You can also follow her on BookBub. www.bookbub.com/profile/Cindy-Ray-Hale. This has been Oops, I Kissed Him Again, a sweet romantic comedy, Maple Creek Romantic Comedy, Book 1, written by Cindy Ray Hale, narrated by Mari B. and John Brattin. Copyright 2020 by Cindy Ray Hale. Production copyright by Cindy Ray Hale.